This is the Londinium 90 AD Chronicles with Gaius, John Batchelor, and Germanicus, Michael Vlahos, examining our time, the first century AD. We're in Londinium, very safe, surrounded by retired centurions. Our emperor is far away in Rome. We reflect on the success of the Roman Empire in the first century AD, and we know in the second century AD. After that, it gets a little dodgy. But in any event, we're eques class. That means we don't work. However, we don't have to spend a lot of money maintaining our senatorial robes. And nor do we have to go to Rome. We can stay here and drink by the Thames and reflect on history. It interests us to spend time in the 21st century. We can see it. We can see everything between here and the 21st century. It's a peculiarity of being eques class. We also can reflect upon the events of our first century AD, thanks to the great god Augustus, who developed an empire that is extremely stable and will be for a century and for a millennium and a half, and then it will have imitators, those who take the Roman Empire and layer in their own peculiarities. There will be the French Empire with Louis Napoleon. There will be the British Empire with Queen Victoria. There will be the American Empire starting, let's say, Dwight Eisenhower. However, we're looking not just at empires, we're looking at events in empires that are turning points, places in the road. Recently, we've examined a deal about how the American Empire is tangled with the former Soviet Empire in Ukraine. But today we're going to turn to the American Empire in particular because of events these last weeks, which are tumbling like a tree collapsing. Uh, Germanicus, a very good evening to you. The moment before the tragedy in Butler, Pennsylvania, the moment before, the question dominating American political life, and indeed the fate of the republic, because America must have a president-elect in November and must have an inauguration in January of 2025. That's in the Constitution. So before the events in Butler, before the tragedy, the presumption was that there was a standoff between the President of the United States, Joseph Biden, and his fervent supporters. I'm mentioning George Clooney only because he published a piece in the New York Times op-ed page, which is itself a Democratic place of esteem. And we're told that that letter had the at least approval, if not help, of Barack Obama, the former president of the United States, who remains very powerful and popular in the Democratic Party, and who was the man who chose Joe Biden to be vice president in 2008. So before the Butler tragedy, where do you measure we were in the life cycle of this empire, the American empire? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. We were in the midst of a transformative and perilous passage that really kicked off with the election of 2016. And everything that has happened since has represented a slow stripping away of all of the rituals and the framework of stability, as you mentioned with Rome. The framework of stability for Rome was the Augustan system. The framework of stability for the United States has been the constitutional order. And the constitutional order has been slowly, if not coming apart, then losing bits and pieces of itself, hence the stripping away. And so the day before the assassination attempt, the major issue and the enveloping panic within Blue, the Democratic Party, was how to maintain the continuity of an orderly process within the norms of the constitutional order in order to deal with a coming apart of the leader. And that is something that occupied all energy and attention. And the Blue thought that this was the key issue, which, if it could be resolved, would at least allow them to move forward, if not actually prevail in the upcoming election. And then, of course, they got blindsided by the events in Butler, Pennsylvania. But everything that's been happening since 2016 has been a very slow stripping away of the carapace and the ligaments of the constitutional order bit by bit. And part of that has been in and up to yesterday, dealing mostly with succession. Now, of course, the picture is transformed. It's a new kind of constitutional situation that we have entered.
I mentioned that this is the moment before Butler. So the world, according to the Democratic Party, was that Joe Biden was not up to the re-election campaign. They were not dealing directly with the question of Joe Biden is not ready to be the president of the United States. However, the only suggestion that I saw as an alternative was his vice president, Kamala Harris, which makes sense. It's logical. But that was the alternative. And that was not entirely acceptable to the talking class. So we had no resolution whatsoever. And there's reason to believe that resolution is still not available. Is that correct, Germanicus?
No. And in fact, it's been put on hold. It's been frozen because it's been superseded, and there is no pathway to reopening it, in large part because of the consequences and spillover from the assassination attempt. So here, maybe it would be useful to lay out what the crisis is about, because it's partly about succession within the Democratic Party. It's very much also about preventing Mr. Trump from being elected, just as it was about getting rid of or defenestrating Mr. Trump while he was president. And so the effort to exclude a red succession under Mr. Trump is one of the elements, but the other element is the incontinence, if you will, of Blue in its ability to successfully stage and order its own succession process. And it was immobilized before the event at Butler, and now it is completely frozen. And there is almost nothing at the moment that Blue can do. And so it is in a suspension.
We have a formula here that doesn't resolve itself. See if I can state it correctly. There is no resolution in the Democratic Party for what comes next. At the same time, there is resolution that Mr. Trump and the Republicans must not come next.
Right.
The word impasse is inadequate, Germanicus.
Well, here's a kind of metaphorical, or like a parable, an allegory. Had the assassination been successful, it would have broken the logjam. It would have also precipitated an immediate national crisis. And I think that speaks to the deeper problem within Blue, is that they have no way to effectively prevent a red administration come November. And they have no way.
1 minute, Germanicus. Go ahead.
And they have no way to create a path to a Blue administration. In other words, they're in a cul-de-sac, a strategic cul-de-sac, in large part of their own making.
We have events of these last hours now that must be acknowledged, although not solved. We're not looking into the details. We're looking into the theme of assassination or succession, either one. As Roman citizens, we're very familiar. The Julian-Claudian family did not end peacefully, no instance. Augustus might have, although there was always the suggestion that he was helped along. However, what we have now is a way of reviewing what is upsetting to everyone in the 21st century, which is an assassination attempt on the leading candidate, the presumed candidate for the Republican Party, meeting in Milwaukee within hours. And Germanicus, the assassination did not happen. I've seen reviews after reviews saying how close we came. You have looked on other chief executives, other commanders in chief, other heroes of the American story, and seized upon George Washington. Why so?
George Washington had his own brush with death. At the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755, after the commanding general Braddock had been killed by an Indian flintlock, George Washington, as a 23-year-old, stepped up, and he managed to extricate what remained of the army and get it back home to, what is now West Virginia. And he did so by mobilizing a rear guard, just like a Cassius Chaerea did in extricating a small portion of those who survived the terrible Battle of the Teutoburger Vault. And with that small force, he held off the French and Indians and allowed the rest of the British and colonial army to retreat. Now, in the process of that, he was struck 4 times, and he had 4 horses shot out from under him, but he was untouched. The bullets went through his uniform, and this created a myth of a man who was divinely appointed by God, as it were. There was an Indian chief who traveled 15 years later just to meet Washington, and this Indian chief had been an ally of the French and was a leader directing the fire of the Indians to wipe out every single British and colonial officer. And he said to Washington, I have traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle. Now, this was not an opinion simply of what were then called superstitious Indians. It was a belief shared by the citizens of Virginia, and then soon to be the 13 colonies as they came together. And Washington had an aura about him that absolutely reinforced, redoubled, intensified his leadership. He was not a charismatic figure. He was more like a semi-divine figure because of the myth that had been created around him. He had transformed what should have been his last day on earth into a heroic apotheosis. And this has been true of other American leaders, presidents, who survived assassination
Yes,
attempts.
let me tell quickly the story. William McKinley, President of the United States, elected very happily in 1896, taking office in 1897. His first term was distinguished, happy for the Republicans, who were keen on gold and not silver, but that's a complicated story.
Mm.
Vice president died of natural causes, and he had no vice president. So they came to the convention in 1900 in Philadelphia, and they were looking for a vice president. Teddy Roosevelt was hiding from the selection committee because he didn't want the vice presidency. It was worthless to him. He'd been the Rough Rider. He'd been the governor. He'd been in the civil service. He'd been an assistant secretary of the Navy. In his own mind, he was famous, and a vice president meant that he would disappear. Nonetheless, they found him, and they made him vice president. So in September of 1901, William McKinley was at the Buffalo Centennial exhibition, and a man came forward with, I believe he had a scarf over the pistol, and shot McKinley in the abdomen. McKinley was taken to a Buffalo mansion where he lay for several days. They didn't have X-rays, but they did have an X-ray machine that was rudimentary, and they realized that the bullet, in those days, they thought we can leave a bullet inside you. So it went on for days, and McKinley died very badly. Not before Teddy Roosevelt arrived to see that McKinley was mending and that he didn't have to worry about becoming president of the United States. And then McKinley died. While Roosevelt was back in the woods in New York, Roosevelt went through all kinds of stress, get a special train to get to Buffalo and be sworn in the dining room of one of the prominent members of Buffalo. That's the first part. Now, Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, and to the shock of many members of the Republican Party, they called him a cowboy. He served ably for 8 years and chose his successor, William Howard Taft. But in 1912, Roosevelt, who was ill ever since his visit to the River of Doubt in South America, he had diseases that we know they couldn't discern in those days. He was not the vigorous Teddy Roosevelt that he'd been when he was a younger man. Nevertheless, he decided to challenge Taft, and that left him to the Chicago Convention, where he was rejected by the party, and Taft was renominated for the presidency. Roosevelt wouldn't have none of it, and he decided he was going to be a third party. Coming out of a Milwaukee hotel, getting into his car to make a speech to the Buffalo Republicans, he was shot by a man, John Schrank, who later on was determined to be not sensible. However, the important point here that Michael makes about Washington is that the bullet went directly at Roosevelt's heart. It penetrated a glasses case and the manuscript that he was going to speak of that was folded up over his heart and reached his body so that there was blood all over his shirt and a hole in his overcoat. And yet he went on to make the speech for 90 minutes before he allowed himself to be taken to the hospital. There, Germanicus, I turn it back to you, a man who would not die.
I use the word apotheosis, which is an ascent. And we know from our time in the Imperium Romanum or Romanorum that the emperor represents all of Rome and thus embodies Rome and is divinely touched. And the ascendance of the emperor, of course, occurs after his death, which is very much a kind of ritual of legitimization. But the fact of a great leader suffering and being punished, and then being in a position where he puts himself forward for sacrifice and survives is one of those crystallizing moments. And it creates not simply a hero, but a man for the ages.
1 minute. It's 1 minute.
It goes back to Alexander the Great and his capacity to take wounds one after the other. It is Roosevelt's making the speech that counts. It is Reagan's making the joke or jokes when after he was shot. It is, in other words, the courage and transcendence of the leader that changes everything. And in Trump's case, he has a special relationship with the populares. They look to him, and his willingness to sacrifice and his steadfastness and his heroic character after being hit and his defiance creates a mythic bond between the leader and the people that is similar in many ways to Roosevelt and Reagan, but most to George Washington. And I think this is a transformative moment, a pivotal moment in American life, the life of our nation.
We're by the Thames drinking our cup of wine on our way to the theater. We'll sacrifice to the great god Augustus. We're reflecting upon events in the 21st century, not war fighting at this moment, having more to do with the succession struggle in an empire, the American empire. And before the events of these last hours, the struggle turned on a senior figure in the emperor robes, Joe Biden, a senior figure who chose to continue to be emperor for another term, having been a junior emperor in a previous administration. He's now
Yes.
a senior emperor to continue after 50 plus years at the center of the world, Rome, aka Washington. And there is no particular path for any other person in the emperor's party to take his place unless the emperor acknowledges that he's senior and is standing by to help. But he's no longer going to be emperor in the second term because of his seniority. And Germanicus and I have discussed Tiberius before, who was a very able general and very well thought of. And it was his mother's idea that Augustus adopt him because so many of Augustus's heirs had died mysteriously or accidentally or unfortunately. There are a lot of theories. So Tiberius inherited the robes that he didn't particularly care for. And at some point in his time as emperor, he retired to the island of Capri, which was his personal palace, and indulged himself for the rest of his life, indifferent to what was going on in Rome. There were troubles in Rome. He didn't care. He was emperor. And it came to the Romans, especially Caligula, Germanicus was his real name, the only heir around, that Tiberius had overstayed his welcome. And yet, and there is the problem for the emperor's party and for us, Germanicus, Tiberius won't go. You can't make Tiberius go. The crown is his. And yet, imagining Tiberius continuing for 4 more years, given the trouble of the globe, seems reckless. How does it seem to you, Germanicus?
One of the great utilities to insight is the fact that we, in the Imperium Romanum or Romanorum in the first century, can understand things that Americans do not have the knowledge dispensation to see. In other words, Americans in the 21st century do not have the permission to see what has actually happened to their constitutional order. And in many ways, I think it's useful for us to remind Americans that what happened in the transition from a Republican constitutional order to the emperor-oriented order under Augustus was that the succession and the way in which the succession was managed became all important, which it hadn't been, obviously, in the Republic, where you had 2 consuls, and every year there were new consuls. In the Roman order, which was more stable, especially than the later Republic, you had the problem of succession. And in Rome, the problem of succession and the constitutional order being preserved was through civil war, which was arguably their vehicle for succession and new legitimation. In the United States today, it is a post-Republican, meaning Republican with a small r, it is a post-Republican imperial succession that is different from Rome's, but just as tumultuous at this point, because you have institutionalized factions, binary factions that must essentially fight each other to install a new emperor, which is different from Rome. But the thing that the American system at this point, as an imperial system, has in common with Rome is that the succession is based on struggle, on a battle. In Rome, it was a relatively well understood short Civil War process. In the US, it hasn't really quite been totally institutionalized or formulated in a way that everyone understands. So there is great uncertainty now in the United States as to how a succession can be managed if both sides are unwilling to give. In Rome, of course, you had different sides, different factions, but the short Civil War would settle that, as in the Year of the Four Emperors, 68, 69. Today, in the United States, there is no pathway towards succession that people can agree upon, and it is uncertain as to whether the former pathway, which was called an election, is still viable, because the acceptance of legitimacy is what's critical. And in Rome, it could be accepted because it would be solved by a short civil war. In the United States, there's no understood pathway to succession. And this is causing enormous psychic and emotional upheaval in the United States, which has been redoubled and intensified by the assassination attempt.
And at this point, Germanicus, there is no particular way to move Tiberius aside that I can see, and that was true for Germanicus.
Well, this is a double problem, because one of the two factions in the moiety, which is blue, the Democrats, they don't have a succession process for within their own faction. And Republicans, who are unified in terms of their candidate for emperor, are engaged in what amounts to a near civil war with the Democrats, but the Democrats aren't able to put forward a viable candidate. So it is really a deep uncertainty now as to what will happen.
And the voters are asked to choose, but there is no choice. This is a conundrum on the stage.
Well, when the factions are equally marshaled and of equal size and capability, it's very hard to see. One of the virtues of the Roman system is there would always be multiple factions, which meant that it was never two equal factions, except for Theodosius Theodosius the Great in 395. Most of the time, like the Year of the Four Emperors, it would resolve itself quickly, because there would be one candidate for emperor who was stronger than the others, and others would fall by the wayside. In the situation we have today, there is no obvious path for resolution, because both sides are nearly equivalent.
One observation is that we both lived through 1968. And I've quoted you Shakespeare already. When sorrows come, they come not in single spies, but in battalions. We're at the beginning of this process, Germanicus. There are a lot of bumps ahead. Do you agree?
Yes, and I can say in just a sentence why those bumps are going to be big and why they're going to be protracted. Because we're at the early stage of trying to figure out what the constitutional succession process will be for the future. And that is why it's so scary. And that's why, being unresolved, it will take some sort of struggle with or without major bloodshed. But the fact is, we're not yet at the stage where both sides are willing to agree to some pathway ahead. They both double down on victory, and that means a battle. And the battle is going to be protracted, because there has to be a constitutional resolution that everyone accepts.
Germanicus and Gaius, Londinium 90 AD Chronicles, observing the peculiar situation in the 21st century that does not have a resolution, not yet, not at hand. I'm John Batchelor.